The Will of the Many by James Islington is the most exciting start to a series that I have read in a long time, probably since The Name of the Wind. It is also another piece of evidence that the secret formula for fantasy success is calling your first book the X of the Y. The Will of the Many has a propulsive plot, engaging characters, and a delightful mixture of tropes and twists on tropes. But the thing I most enjoy about the book, which it definitely shares with The Name of the Wind, is that it is theory-rich. It answers just enough of the questions it poses to feel satisfying, while leaving a lot of material for readers to speculate about. In this video, I'm going to discuss 5 theories about the book. Even if none of them ends up being canon, I think it's great and impressive that Islington created the imaginative space for them to be things his readers might consider. Before we dive in, a quick note on pronunciation. I'm going to try to use the guide at the end of The Will of the Many, but if you're like me, this will mean a lot of the names sound different to how they did in your head. Theory 1. Luceum and Obiteum are heaven and hell. In the final chapters of The Will of the Many, we learn that the world Viz inhabits, known as Res, is just one of 3 linked realms, with the other 2 being Luceum and Obiteum. The first theory is that these other realms correspond to heaven and hell, or, in Greco-Roman terms, the Elysian Fields and Tartarus. The basic version of this theory is just that Obiteum will be darker and more hellish than Res, while Luceum will be lighter and more heavenly. But there is also a premium version of the theory, which is that dying in Res, whether or not you pass through a labyrinth or some other kind of gate, will necessarily send you to either Luceum or Obiteum, with your destination depending in some way on what you did in Res. If true, this would have major story implications, since it would mean that characters who have died, including Viz's family and Qualidus, could potentially feature later on in the narrative. The case for this theory begins with names. Luceum and Obiteum roughly translate from Latin to mean place of light and place of death. Meanwhile, res literally means stuff, but likely refers to the Latin phrase res publica, meaning state or commonwealth. This sets up a classic trio: the good place, the bad place, and the normal everyday world. We get another clue when Viz explores the first set of ruins on Solovargus. He trips a switch that causes 3 different maps of the island to appear. The first map is the Solovargus that Viz knows. The second looks mostly identical, but has sloping beaches to the north rather than sheer bluffs, and a small town nestled in the shadow of a mountain. The third map also shows Solovargus, but utterly destroyed. The island is treeless, with a crater marring the western side and a giant, unsettling sphere hovering over it. Assuming these maps show Luceum, Obiteum, and Res, they essentially confirm the basic heaven and hell theory. One world is the world Viz knows, one is somewhat more idyllic, and one is somewhat more chthonic. As an aside, it's worth noting that this isn't the only plausible interpretation of the 3 maps. Because this scene takes place before we learn about the different realms, a natural reading is that it shows Solovargus at 3 different times. In the past, we know Solovargus had beaches and a town beneath a mountain. In the present, we know the beaches have been turned into bluffs, and there is also a ruined town beneath a mountain. Notably, we later learn that these ruins feature a giant dome. In the future, perhaps, there is a giant sphere hovering above a crater in approximately the location of the town, which could suggest that the dome was actually a buried sphere all along. But back to the evidence. There are a couple of points in the book where we get direct descriptions of other realms. When Viz touches Esteban at the Normarkia, he sees a world with a smoky, lightning-cracked sky and a towering black pyramid. This sounds like a description of the underworld. When Viz arrives in Luceum at the end of the book, he finds himself in the middle of a vast rotunda surrounded by columns. White stone is everywhere, and there are cloud-topped mountains in the distance. This sounds at least a bit like a description of heaven. I think all of this is sufficient evidence to conclude that the basic heaven and hell theory will probably pan out. However, evidence for the premium theory is a bit more patchy. Again, This premium theory is that dying in res sends you to either Luceum or Obiteum, whether or not you go through a gate, with your destination depending on what you did in res. So we're looking for evidence of ostensibly dead characters showing up, perhaps in other realms, or of characters in res paying special attention to what they do in life and how they die. The most telling scene for the premium theory comes near the end of the book, when Viz is recovering from the injuries he received during the Eurydice. He sees his late father, Cristobal, sitting at his bedside. They speak, and his father offers comfort and catharsis. Later, when Viz wakes, for real, he finds a wooden boat on his bedside table. There are at least 3 reasons to think that this scene supports the premium heaven and hell theory. Most obviously, the wooden boat is one of a set that Viz carved as a child and last saw in Cristobal's possession. So the thought is that Cristobal somehow took it with him to the afterlife before leaving it here for Viz. Second, when Viz moves to wipe away his tears during the exchange with his father, he is surprised to find himself bound to the bed. We later learn that this is true. The surgeons have strapped him in to operate. It suggests that during the conversation with Cristobal, Viz is actually perceiving reality. Finally, there's the content of what Cristobal says. When Viz tells him, "You're dead," Cristobal replies, "Yes." Then, when Viz remembers Qualidus dying, Cristobal says, quote, "You mourn your friend, but death is a doorway. You will see him again. No one is ever truly lost." This is a clear suggestion that when people die in res, they go someplace else, with Luceum and Obiteum being the obvious candidates. But let's come back to Qualidus, because his death itself is another clue that dying in res may not be altogether permanent. Qualidus is arguably Viz's best friend over the course of the book, and the only person he feels comfortable even partially opening up to. As such, the fact that Qualidus dies following an offstage encounter with a nameless low-level grunt is kind of abrupt. If this actually is the last we see of Qualidus in the series, I might even call it unsatisfying. But, if the premium version of the heaven and hell theory is correct, we have a way for him to return. In other words, the premium theory makes sense from the perspective of narrative payoff as well as being hinted at in the text. As an aside, it's interesting that the circumstances of Qualidus's death seem to mirror those of Viz's younger sister, Corinza. Both die while Viz is attempting to drag them to safety over long distances shortly after having expressed their absolute trust in him. I'm not sure what to make of this. Viz's other close friend at the Academy is Aiden, who belongs to an obscure tribe that may or may not be called the Adu. As we'll see later, there's reason to think these people are in some way linked to the goings-on at Solovargus, presumably including the gate to Luceum and Obiteum. We also learn from Aiden that part of his people's creed is Dram Kai Freith, or the right to death. This is a code that honors death as a sacrifice and sees living past one's time as a disgrace. In other words, Aiden's people pay special attention to the circumstances in which they die. The last piece of evidence for this theory is also the most speculative. It's essentially a theory unto itself, but one that, if true, supports the premium heaven and hell theory. This is the idea that the story of Siror and Lannistia is actually a retelling of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. In Greek mythology, Orpheus is a marvelous singer who becomes so overcome with grief at the death of his wife Eurydice that he ventures into the underworld to save her. Hades lets Eurydice leave, but only on the condition that Orpheus never looks back on the return journey. Orpheus can't help himself, he looks back, and Eurydice returns to the underworld permanently. Over the course of The Will of the Many, we hear a couple of versions of Siror and Lannistia's story, and get a few other clues about what might have happened to them. The official story is that Siror killed himself by jumping off a cliff because he thought he had killed Lannistia. Viridius also believed Lannistia to be dead, but when he realized she wasn't, he carried her back to safety. Siror's body was later recovered, but had been so badly mauled by wolves that there was no way to tell what really happened. Lannistia and Ulki Score both think this official story is a lie, and that Viridius may have been responsible for Siror's death, and Lanistea's distinctive injuries. In terms of other clues, we know that Lanistea's injuries, in particular having no eyes, are shared by the zombie beings that Viz encounters. These are apparently mindless corpses that can move and recite rote speech, but don't die from normally fatal injuries like being stabbed in the heart. When Viz asks one of them to demonstrate the labyrinth only if they are not alive, the zombie proceeds with the demonstration. This all suggests that eyelessness could be a symptom of dying, at least in some circumstances. The last clue comes at the end of the book, when we learn that a version of Searaw is still alive in Obiteum, suggesting he went through the same copying process as Viz, except that the version of him back in Res died. So, the suggestion is that what actually happened was this. Lanistea died and went to Obiteum, where she became an eyeless zombie. Searaw, overcome with grief, ventured through the labyrinth to Obiteum to save her. He succeeded, and somehow managed to return Lanistea to Res with her mind mostly intact, but in the process became trapped in Obiteum himself. This is, beat for beat, the same story as Orpheus and Eurydice, except that their roles get switched at the very end. Lanistea's eyelessness could even be an oblique nod to the idea of not looking back. This account would make the official story mostly correct, in that Searaw sacrificed himself out of grief for Lanistea, Viridius really did believe Lanistea was dead, and really did save her. But it would also make Ulquiskor and Lanistea correct, in that the official story leaves out important details. And of course, the account only gets off the ground at all if you equate Obiteum with the underworld and allow that dying in Res can send you there. Theory 2. Belli is still alive. When Viz attempts to run the labyrinth for real, near the end of the book, he is shocked to discover Belli's body having apparently been killed by the remnants. Viz assumes she died while trying to reach the gate herself. This is surprising because Belli is considered the best student at running the labyrinth. It's also confusing because, as Viz later realizes, he can't explain why her corpse would still be present when the labyrinth has presumably retracted after her run and re-emerged for his own. Now, if the premium heaven and hell theory is right, Belli could still be alive in the sense of having travelled to Luceum or Obiteum after her death. But, based on what we know about the world of the books, there's actually a way she could still be alive that is completely independent of the heaven and hell theory. This requires two key ideas. The first is that we don't technically know whether Belli died while entering the labyrinth, as Viz assumes, or while returning having successfully completed it. If it's the latter, then presumably there are versions of Belli in both Luceum and Obiteum. In other words, she's still alive. One thing I like about this theory is that if you only get as far as the first key idea, it really feels like a long shot. The first key idea doesn't explain why Belli's body is still present, and it actually makes her failure more surprising, since returning through the labyrinth is much easier than getting through in the first place. The second key idea solves both problems. This is the idea that Belli began her return trip while Viz was in the maze. This explains why she failed, either because the remnants weren't where she was expecting, or because Viz moved a wall to block her path. It also explains why her corpse is present at all, since the labyrinth wouldn't have retracted between her death and Viz finding her body. Now, the theory does present two new problems, but I don't think either of these is especially serious, and I actually think working through them makes the theory look more promising. First, there's a problem about how it would work for two people to be in the labyrinth at the same time. Would it respond to both of their braces? Wouldn't they hear each other? And so on. Second, there's a problem about whether the timeline makes sense, both with respect to when Viz and Belli each arrive at the labyrinth, and with respect to the timing of events during Viz's run. For the first problem, we're simply not told how the labyrinth responds to multiple braces or multiple runners. We know there are multiple braces available because Viz sacrifices one when he first asks a zombie to demonstrate the maze. We also know the labyrinth is large and somewhat soundproof. Viz explicitly notes that he doesn't see any remnants in the first 5 minutes of his run, but he does hear one a couple of times, scraping along in nearby corridors. This suggests both that sound doesn't travel that far in the labyrinth, and perhaps also that the remnants were otherwise engaged. In either case, it seems like the only way Viz would become aware of Belli in the maze is if Belli moves a wall in his path, if they both try to move the same wall simultaneously, or if Belli is near enough and makes enough noise when she's attacked that Viz hears her. So, suppose she enters shortly after Viz, when the remnants are still close to her end of the maze. One or more of them would turn back, attack her, and Viz might still be far enough away not to hear anything. Turning to timelines, we can work out from the text that Viz arrives at the labyrinth about 2 in the morning. He does 4 or 5 trial runs using the overview, with each run taking maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then he attempts it for real. This means he starts his run at about 2:30 in the morning. He spends the first 5 minutes of the run in a kind of flow state before discovering Belli's body. Then he spends a few minutes in a mad dash to the end. After he goes through the gate, an unknown amount of time passes before he wakes up again and makes the return trip. From Belli's perspective, we can work out that she must arrive at the labyrinth between about 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. This window is consistent with Belli dying on either the way in or the way out. But dying on the way out does seem more coincidental, since it would mean Belli just happened to start her return in the few minutes after Viz started his run. However, the real clincher in terms of timelines is the description we get of Belli's body. Viz observes that there is, quote, blood still dripping. Forensics-wise, this would only be the case for a surprisingly short time, maybe 15 or 20 minutes after the injury occurred. This means that Belli must have died during Viz's actual run or during one of his trial runs. But if the latter were true, then she would have appeared on the overview, since we're told that motion will be displayed when present. As a result, my best guess, given all of the above, is that Belli is still alive, has achieved synchronism, and will probably be the other from your world that Viz is about to meet in Luceum. Theory 3. There is a gate to Luceum and Obiteum on Suus. The island of Suus, where Viz grew up, seems closely linked to the island of Solovargus, which is the only known location of a gate to the other realms, so much so that we might suspect Suus is home to a gate of its own. But aside from both being isolated islands, what links these two places? Once again, the timeline is significant. 3 years before the Will of the Many begins, Solovargus substantially increased its security, turning beaches into bluffs and building the seawall. It's reasonable to assume that this security increase was prompted by discoveries made at the ruins, which is to say, discoveries about Luceum, Obiteum, and the gate to reach them. At the same time that Solovargus increased its security, Caten invaded Suus. The invasion came unexpectedly, while peace negotiations were ongoing, and at a time when one expert observer expected Suus to hold out for 5 to 10 more years. The implication is that whatever prompted the security increase also prompted the invasion, further suggesting a connection between the two islands. As an aside, Suus was not the only place Caten unexpectedly invaded at this time. In discussing the fate of his people, Aiden says that they were largely ignored even after Caten had conquered Chimera, until around 3 years ago when the hierarchy attacked without warning. Caten's motive for attacking Suus, we are told, is that they feared what the people of Suus knew. It's implied this secret knowledge has to do with the weapon Estevan unleashes at the Normarkia, which itself seems connected to interworld travel, given Viz gets transported when he touches Estevan. But if the scene near the end of the book with Viz's father is more than a vision, it suggests the secret knowledge is about interworld travel in general, rather than the weapon in particular. It also seems significant that Viz spent his years on Suus being trained as a diplomat, with emphasis on somewhat suspicious subjects. Suus is described as the last holdout from the hierarchy, which makes it very unclear where they would send a diplomat to besides Caten. But much of Viz's training doesn't seem relevant to Catenan diplomacy, specifically the fact he is fluent in multiple languages Caten has deliberately suppressed. We later learn that one of these languages, Vetusian, seems to be spoken on Luceum, and another of them, Chimerian, is spoken by Aiden's people, who seem generally tied up in this stuff. So the thought is that Viz was being trained as an ambassador to the other realms, which makes most sense if there is a gate to those realms on Suus. Now, if there is a gate on Suus, it would seem a bit odd that Viz doesn't already know about it, given his royal status and the fact he spent his childhood exploring the island's caves, cliffs, and secret tunnels. So, while I wouldn't be surprised if there is a gate, I think their secret knowledge could also just be information about Luceum, Obiteum, or the true nature of the afterlife, without an actual portal. Theory 4. Caten has a secret god-king. The Catenan Republic is modelled closely on the Roman Republic. It has a senate, consuls, baths, triremes, and gladiatorial contests. Even the word rex, meaning king, is considered a slur in Caten, just as it was in the Roman Republic. But according to this theory, that basic analogy is a lie. Caten isn't the Roman Republic, it's the Roman Empire, complete with a single deified autocrat at the very top. In reading The Will of the Many, it feels like you're told a lot about how Catenan society works. The book opens with a table of Catenan rankings detailing how many people's will each rank can draw on. The chapters drip-feed further information about how society is structured, up to and including actual census figures. It feels like there's a clear picture of things, and if you just put the pieces together, it would all make sense. But if you do put the pieces together, you find a number of mysteries remain. In particular, it's very unclear how the uppermost echelons of Catenan society operate. We know that only the 3 senatorial pyramids stretch beyond Quartus. We know that military has 2 Domidii and seems to have a princeps as well. There are 2 consuls, one drawn from each of military and religion, and 1 censor drawn from governance. But we don't know if they always have the same rank. The current censor, Qualicus's father, is a Tertius, but is considered one of the 3 most powerful people in the Senate. This is surprising, since it would make him more powerful than most of the Domidii and Principes, assuming all 3 pyramids go all the way to the top. All of this suggests there's something fishy going on with the top levels of the Catenan Republic, but it hardly gets us to God King territory. That requires a few more steps and some maths. The first step is kind of meta. On James Islington's website, he name-checks just 2 books as particular sources of inspiration. One of them is The Name of the Wind, which I've already mentioned. The other is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, for which I'm about to give major spoilers. At the start of Mistborn, it's generally believed that 1,000 years earlier, the hero of ages defeated an unknown threat, achieved godhood, and now rules over the world as an immortal emperor. But, at the end of the book, we learn that the emperor is not actually the hero of ages, but rather his former advisor, who betrayed the hero and stole immortality for himself. The idea of society being founded on a lie might not be common enough to qualify as a trope, but it does crop up from time to time, perhaps most famously in The Wizard of Oz. So the thought here is that, given Islington's admiration for Mistborn, his own series might make use of the same idea. The hierarchy might be built on a similar lie. The main piece of textual evidence for this comes midway through the book, when Qualicus reveals to Viz that the census data isn't what you would expect. Qualicus tells us the total population of the Republic, along with the total numbers of quartii, quintii, and sextii. Combined with other tidbits from throughout the book, we can calculate the total number of people accounted for in the senatorial pyramids, as well as all other pyramids that peak at Sextus and above. What we find is that most people in Caten, about 85% of them, don't fit into any of these pyramids. There are a few ways of explaining this. It could be that most people in Caten are Octavii who don't have Decede, or else live in two-tier pyramids that end at Septimus. But this seems like it would conflict with what Viz has observed. Alternatively, it could be that most people in Caten are under 18, but this would be demographically surprising. The most likely explanation, I think, is that there is a lot of will going somewhere other than the official pyramids. One place it could be going is to the God King. A more obviously relevant and less mathematically involved clue comes when Viz is exploring the first set of ruins on Solovargus. He finds an inscription in Old Vetusian that reads as follows: "In trying to become God, they created him." So, the overall theory here is that many years ago, before will use became widespread in Caten, a group of will-using cultists started to experiment with how much one person could wield. Perhaps seeking to make their own god, they poured more and more will into one person, ultimately creating some kind of incredibly powerful being. This being used their power first to gain ascendancy in Caten, then to structure Catenan society, conceal their own existence, and commence a plan of intensive population growth through conquest and pronatal legislation. As a final clue that this might be going on, it's worth noting that the word hierarchy, which is used in the book by both the natives of Suus and Chimera, as well as being the name of the overall series, has an interesting etymology. Although today it means a ranked system, it's related to words like monarchy, anarchy, and oligarchy, which mean rule by one, rule by none, and rule by the strong. So what does hierarchy mean if you break it down to root words? Rule by a sacred king. Theory 5. Indol is gay. This last theory is the least ambitious of the lot, but, if true, is a great example of clever writing. At the military council on Suus, Indol tells Viz that he knows Viz grew up there. He then says he's good at keeping secrets, to which Viz replies, "So am I." In context, the implication is that Viz also knows a secret of Indol's, which he is offering to keep on condition Indol does the same. Indol doesn't seem to know what Viz is talking about for a moment, then he glances at Emissa and groans. Now, the only significant secret of Indol's that Viz knows is his plan to defect to religion, which Viz learned from Emissa. So we assume this is the secret both Indol and Viz have in mind. But, near the end of the book, Indol tells Viz outright that he never shared his plan to defect with Emissa. This immediately raises the question of how Emissa found out about it, which, at least for me, was enough of a smokescreen that I didn't initially notice a puzzle it creates about the exchange on Suus. The puzzle is this: if Indol never told Emissa about his plan to defect, what secret does he think Viz will keep on his behalf? It looks like Indol must have some other secret which he thinks Viz found out about from Emissa, and which is a big enough deal to be a fair trade for Viz's true background. Indol being gay perfectly explains this. We know that homosexuality is a serious offence in the hierarchy, being prohibited by birthright. This makes it reasonable to trade for Viz's secret. We also have reason to think Emissa knows about Indol's sexuality, because she seems very confident that he has no romantic interest in Belli. On top of this, the theory could explain the rift between Indol and his father, which is otherwise mysterious. What I find so satisfying about this theory, and so clever about the writing, is that it feels like the scene on Suus is a puzzle hidden in the text which you don't notice at the time. Then, when you get to Indol's revelation at the end of the book, you notice that one of the things it says is, by the way, that earlier scene on Suus was actually a puzzle. I'm recording this about 2 months before The Strength of the Few releases. That means these theories could be vindicated or crash and burn pretty soon. At the start of the video, I said I wouldn't mind if they all crash and burn. This is because it won't change how enjoyable they were to think through. The God King theory is kind of like a maths question, while Indol's sexuality has more the flavour of a logic puzzle. Meanwhile, Belli's death is like a murder mystery with timeline and blood spatter analysis. The Will of the Many is an immersive page-turner, but it kind of doubles as a puzzle book too. Now, it might go without saying, but I also wouldn't mind if every one of the theories in this video ends up being vindicated. This is partly because predicting how a story will go can be immensely satisfying if it takes enough work, but it's mainly because there are still so many other questions. I genuinely feel like I've hardly scratched the surface, and I'm sure book 2 will have a bunch more mysteries to explore.